You are inside Solomon's palace, not in the temple, not in the holy place, but in the other center of power, where decisions were whispered before they became decrees, where rings were sewn with gold, where men trembled before walking through a door. The air is heavy. It smells like cedar from Lebanon, burnt oil, contained sweat, and stone heated by the Jerusalem sun. Your feet touch a cold floor. In front of you, tall columns support halls lined with rare wood. Guards remain motionless, spears in hands, eyes watchful. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the dry sound of a scribe scratching parchment. And then you notice something. The silence of this palace is not peace, it's tension. Because behind the glory of Israel's wisest king, behind the gold, the horses, the tributes, and the stories that span 3,000 years, there was a question that no one dared to ask out loud. How much does it cost to keep a kingdom shining? Archaeological evidence from the ancient Near East shows that royal complexes were not just homes for kings. They were government machines, control spaces, places where taxes were calculated, food was stored, treaties were sealed, and workers were sent to projects they might never choose to build. And Solomon's palace was not small. According to 1 Kings 7, it took him 13 years to build his own house, almost twice the time allotted for building the temple. This already changes everything. The king who built the house of God in 7 years spent 13 years building the political heart of his own power. But that's still not the most uncomfortable thing. Look closer. Imagine an ordinary man from northern Israel arriving in Jerusalem with a petition. Maybe your village is overloaded. Maybe your children were called to work. Perhaps the harvest was barely enough to feed the household, but the royal officials still demand grain, oil, animals, labor. He enters this palace and sees what his efforts help to sustain. Cedar, hewn stone, gold, servants, horses, banquets, foreign diplomats. And for a moment, he understands something that maybe Solomon didn't want to see. The splendor of the kingdom had deep roots, and some of these roots were embedded in the people's backs. But before we judge Solomon too quickly, we need to back up, because this palace wasn't born just out of vanity. It was born of a promise, of an inheritance, of a newly unified nation trying to appear invincible to the world. And that's where the story really begins. To understand the palace, you need to stop imagining it as a royal house. That was a machine. According to 1 Kings 7, Solomon's complex included the house of the forest of Lebanon, the portico of the columns, the portico of the throne, the king's residence, and the house of Pharaoh's daughter. It wasn't just architecture, it was a message. Each hall told the visitor, this kingdom is no longer a confederation of tribes. This is a state. You feel it when you walk down the halls. Cedar wood releases a resinous scent and heat. The light enters from the side, touching columns, doors, benches. Archaeologists and scholars note that palaces in the ancient Levant functioned as administrative, judicial, and diplomatic centers. There, ambassadors were received, records were kept, taxes were assessed, cases were judged, and the work of the kingdom was organized. And Solomon needed that, because governing Israel was no longer just about listening to elders at the city gate. The kingdom now had borders, trade routes, fortified cities, tax districts, officials, warehouses, stables, foreign alliances, and monumental works. But here's what changes everything. In the 1 Kings 4, the kingdom appears divided into 12 administrative districts. Each district held court for 1 month of the year. This seemed efficient, an ordered system, a supply calendar, grain, wine, oil, cattle, fowl, all flowing into Jerusalem like blood rushing into a heart. But the disturbing detail is this. These districts did not perfectly follow the old tribal borders. Evidence suggests that Solomon was reorganizing the people around the palace, not just tribal tradition. Israel's old identity was beginning to be bent under the weight of a centralized administration. You see the scribes sitting near the walls with tablets, seals, scrolls, and beads. In the ancient world, clay seals called bullae were used to authenticate documents and control property. Each mark pressed into the clay said, "This belongs to the king. This has passed through the system. This has been counted." And when everything is counted, everything can be charged. Solomon's palace was beautiful, yes, but it was also the place where people's lives became numbers. You are now in the place where power breathed, not like thunder, like a whisper. In the morning, before the heat rises from the stones of Jerusalem, men begin to gather outside the royal halls. Some bring land disputes, other loads taxes. Others wait only for a word from the king, because a word spoken in that place could lift a city or crush a family. The sound is discreet but constant. Sandals on the floor, cloths brushing against the walls, low voices, the scratching of scribes recording names, measurements, decisions. Evidence from ancient royal courts suggests that no important decision lived only in memory. It needed to be registered, sealed, sent, obeyed, and this changes the image of Solomon. You might imagine the king sitting only to judge dramatic cases, like the famous episode of the 2 women and the baby. But the daily life of power was less theatrical and heavier. They were border agreements, officer appointments, inventory control, sending workers, reply to ambassadors, organization of caravans, supervision of strategic cities. But that's not all. Every decision swept through the kingdom like a wave. An order written in Jerusalem could reach a village in the hills days later, where a father would leave his vineyard to serve in a royal work. An agreement made with foreign merchants could change the price of grain on the market. A marriage alliance could bring prestige, and also new gods, new customs, new tensions. Archaeologists discovered at several sites in ancient Israel urban gate structures with stone benches where trials and business were conducted. But in Solomon's time, part of this local power began to be pulled upward, towards the center, towards Jerusalem, towards the palace. You feel this concentration in the air. The palace wasn't just where the king lived. It was where the kingdom was filtered. Problems entered as human voices and left as decrees. And therein lies the great tension. The more efficient the government became, the more distant the king could become from the faces of the people who supported his glory. Look closer. At the back of the room, perhaps Solomon appears calm, wise, surrounded by counselors, officers, and guards, but each record stacked next to it carries a life. Each seal pressed into the clay carries a consequence, and power, when it gets used to numbers, begins to forget names. Solomon's wealth was not discreet. It shone before you reached the throne. Imagine walking through a hall where sunlight hits golden shields hanging on the walls. The reflection is warm, almost aggressive, as if the palace itself wants to force your eyes to bow. The smell of cedar mixes with the polished metal, the light incense, the leather of the guards, the foreign scent of emissaries who have come from far away just to see if the rumors are true. And the rumors were. West Kings describes a court supplied with immense quantities of food every day, fine flour, cereals, oxen, sheep, poultry, and animals prepared for the royal table. It wasn't just a banquet, it was political propaganda. In the ancient world, an abundant table said that the king dominated the land, the fields, the herds, the roots, and the men. Archaeological evidence from ancient royal economies shows that royal wealth rarely sat still. It circulated through warehouses, caravans, ports, tributes, and diplomatic gifts. Gold was not just decoration, it was language. It was the way one kingdom said to others, "We have stability, strength, and access to the world." But there is one detail that many miss. Solomon was not just accumulating wealth. He was building an international image. Horses came from Egypt and Cilicia. Goods crossed trade routes. The fame of the king's wisdom attracted visitors. The Queen of Sheba arrives with spices, gold, and precious stones, and the biblical text shows that she is breathless at the organization of the court, the food, the servants, the clothes, the officials, and the sacrifices. She doesn't just see luxury, she sees system. Look closer. For a foreign queen to be impressed, every detail needed to work. The rhythm of the servants, the order of the tables, the posture of the officials, the flow of gifts, the shine of the metals, the architecture of the halls. The entire palace was a carefully managed performance of power. Scholars estimate that the use of cedar from Lebanon in royal buildings was a sign of extreme status, because this material had to be cut from distant mountains, transported over difficult routes, and paid for with alliances, tribute, or agricultural produce. Each beam above his head carried a story of diplomacy, logistics, and cost. You look up. The ceiling doesn't speak, but he charges. Because the big question is not whether Solomon was rich. The question is, who kept this wealth breathing every day? And when the shine is too bright, it doesn't just reveal greatness, it also hides cracks. But the cracks don't appear in the gold first. They appear on the roads. You need to leave the hall for a moment and follow the path leading down from Jerusalem to the villages. The sound changes. The cedar scent disappears. The polished floor gives way to dust. The BR. The metal island gives way to the sun burning the backs of men who walk in line, carrying tools, baskets, blocks, wood, orders they didn't write, and weights they didn't choose. This is where Solomon's kingdom begins to look different. 1 Kings talks about taxes, districts, officials, and obligatory work. The term associated with this system recalls forced service to the state, used for major royal works. Archaeological evidence across the ancient Near East shows that palaces, walls, warehouse cities, and monumental complexes almost always depended on corvée, work required by the government, paid little or nothing, justified as a national duty. But here's what most people miss. The people did not revolt because Solomon built too much. They got tired because they felt like they were being consumed. Imagine a farmer from Ephraim. He does not hate Jerusalem. He does not despise the temple. He grew up hearing that God had chosen David, that Israel had a promise, that unity was a blessing. But now your months are measured by demands. Part of the harvest goes to the court. Part of the time goes to construction work. Some of the children go to distant jobs. And when he looks up, he sees that the palace continues to grow. Evidence suggests that Solomon's reign marked a profound transition from a more decentralized tribal society to a bureaucratic monarchy with taxes, officials, and state projects. It brought strength, it brought stability, it brought fame, but it also brought weight, and the accumulated weight becomes memory. Years later, when Solomon's son Rehoboam takes the throne, the northern tribes do not ask for luxury. They don't ask for revenge, they ask for relief. "Your father made our yoke heavy," they say in 1 Kings 12. This phrase is the crack becoming visible. The yoke already existed. The pain was already there. Solomon's death only gave voice to what the people had been carrying in silence. Look closer. The palace shone in Jerusalem, but in the villages there might be injured hands, scarred shoulders, families counting bags of grain before the collectors arrived. The wealth that impressed the Queen of Sheba may have seemed to many Israelites as something too distant to be theirs and too heavy to be ignored. That's the uncomfortable revelation. Israel's most glorious kingdom also carried within it the seeds of division. Not because Solomon lacked wisdom, but because even wisdom can become corrupted when it starts protecting systems before protecting people. And perhaps the most dangerous question inside that palace wasn't about gold, armies, or treaties. It was this: at what point did the blessing start to feel like a burden? Underneath the visible realm, there was another realm, a kingdom without a throne, no cedar, no gold shields. You are now far from the halls, perhaps on a northern slope, where a family ends the day in silence. The hands are rough. The clothes smell like sweat, straw, and smoke. A woman separates the remaining grain. A man mentally calculates how much will be delivered, how much will remain, how much may not be enough. And yet, in Jerusalem, the lamps continue to burn. This is the part that rarely appears in Solomon's images. Every palace has a shadow, and the taller the building, the bigger the shadow cast on those living around it. Archaeologists discovered in ancient cities administrative structures associated with storage, control of production, and redistribution of food. Large jars, courtyards, gates, recording rooms. These details seem dry until you remember that every measure of grain came from a real land, a real family, a real body bent over the field. But that's not all. Solomon's power was not supported by wealth alone. It was supported by distance. In the palace, an official saw numbers. In the village, a mother saw bread missing. On the throne, a work seemed necessary. On the road, a worker felt the weight of the stone on his shoulder, and this distance is dangerous because it allows tough decisions to appear clean. The decree comes out sealed, beautiful, organized. But when he reaches the ground of life, he smells of dust, the sound of suppressed crying, and the taste of tiredness. Can you feel the tension building? Israel was still the people of the covenant. There was still a temple. There were still sacrifices. There were still psalms. But beneath the liturgy, something human was beginning to break. The northern tribes looked at Jerusalem and perhaps wondered if that magnificent center could still see its outskirts. Look closer. The tragedy is not that Solomon built it. The tragedy is that at some point, the kingdom that was supposed to reflect justice began to demand silence from those who paid the price. And when a people learns to suffer in silence, the rupture has already begun long before the rebellion. And this is where Solomon stops being just an ancient king. It starts to look like a mirror, because perhaps the scariest part of the story is not the wealth, nor the palace, nor the heavy administration. Maybe it's realizing that a man can receive health drinking from God, and yet slowly learning to trust more in what he built than in the one who called him. Do you feel the weight of this? At the beginning, Solomon asks for a heart capable of discernment. He knows that governing people is not simple. He knows that power without wisdom becomes violence. But as the years pass, the same heart that sought discernment begins to be surrounded by rings, horses, gold, foreign wives, political agreements, and symbols of greatness. Archaeological evidence from royal courts in the ancient Near East shows that kings often used marriage, architecture, and wealth accumulation to demonstrate legitimacy. The problem is that the Bible doesn't measure a king just by what he builds. Measure by what your heart adores as you lift. But here's where it shifts. Solomon's danger was not losing everything at once. It was getting used to it. Get used to the shine. With the servants running, with the officers complying, with a full table, with the people supporting, with the idea that if the system worked, then maybe everything was fine. But not everything that works is alive, and not everything that grows comes from God. Solomon's palace forces us to ask a question that spans centuries. What happens when blessing becomes identity? When does what God allowed us to build begin to take the place of God himself? Look closer. You also build palaces, maybe not with cedar and gold, but with control, image, plans, approval, ambition, security. Maybe you are trying to prove that you have won, that you have arrived, that you have value, that no one can ignore you. And without realizing it, what started as a calling can become a burden. What seemed like wisdom can turn into vanity. What seemed like an achievement can begin to take its toll on your peace, your family, your faith, your ability to hear God. Solomon teaches us something uncomfortable. The human heart can transform even sacred gifts into monuments to one's ego. And when that happens, the throne remains standing, but the soul begins to crack. Maybe that's why Solomon's story still bothers us, because she doesn't just ask what happened inside an ancient palace. She asks what happens inside you. What are you building that looks impressive on the outside but is taking a toll on the inside? What part of your life shines for others but weighs heavily on those close to you? What decision do you call wisdom, but maybe it's just fear dressed up as control? Solomon's palace did not fall that day, but the division was already walking through the corridors. And that's the caveat. Not all ruin begins with destruction. Sometimes it starts with success without regret, growth without listening, beauty without justice. True greatness is not building something that everyone admires. It's building without losing your heart. So before looking for more gold, more recognition, more control, look inside. Because God is not just impressed by the size of what you build. He sees who is being crushed to make it stand. If this story made you see Solomon in a different way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who needs to hear this. And answer me in the comments. Which palace are you building today, and how much is it costing your soul?